what took place in row 14 of that cabin between a stone-cold United States Navy SEAL who had survived 2 combat deployments and a lean, 135-pound Chinese-American man in a plain gray jacket wasn't a conversation. It was a lesson. One that the SEAL, a man who had trained to break bodies for a living, would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to people who simply would never believe him. This is that story. The year was 1969. The flight was somewhere over the western United States, bound for Los Angeles. The cabin was half full. It was late afternoon, the kind of flight where people order ginger ale and fall asleep reading magazines. Commander Richard or Ricky Davenport, that's not his real name because he never wanted it published, had just come off a rotation that would give most men permanent nightmares. 2 years of classified operations, jungle terrain, real violence, the kind of work that strips away every ounce of civilian softness a man ever had and replaces it with something cold and efficient. He was not a small man, 6'2", 220 pounds of functional muscle, built not in a gym for aesthetics, but in the field for survival. He had studied judo. He had trained in close-quarters combat under some of the most ruthless hand-to-hand instructors the United States military had ever produced. He had choked men unconscious. He had disarmed trained soldiers. He was, in every measurable sense, a weapon. He settled into his window seat with a coffee, cracked open a newspaper, and paid absolutely no attention to the man who sat beside him. Why would he? The man was small, unremarkable, a slim Asian man, maybe late 20s, wearing a plain gray jacket and dark trousers. He carried no visible muscle. He had quiet eyes behind a pair of tinted glasses. He sat down lightly, almost like he barely weighed anything, and placed a book on his tray table. Ricky gave him one glance and looked away. He'd spent years in environments where underestimating people got you killed, but in a different way, that same psychology worked in reverse. On a commercial flight, surrounded by businessmen and families, a quiet, small man reading a book registered as exactly 0 threat. He didn't even catch the man's name. Not yet. The flight leveled out. Ricky set down his newspaper. His coffee had gone cold. He looked out the window at nothing, the kind of mental blankness that only soldiers and survivors know, that gray internal quiet that comes after years of hypervigilance. The man beside him spoke first. "Long flight?" Ricky looked over. The man was smiling, not the nervous smile of someone making small talk, but the easy, genuinely curious smile of someone who actually wanted to know. "Could be longer," Ricky said. He was not a man of many words. "You military?" the man asked. That caught him slightly. Ricky had been out of uniform for 3 days, no insignia, civilian clothes. "What makes you say that?" "The way you sit," the man said simply. "You're watching the aisle without watching it. Old habit." Ricky paused. Then, against his own instincts, he almost smiled. "You a cop?" The man laughed. It was a quick, genuine laugh. "No, instructor mostly. I teach movement." "Movement?" Ricky repeated. "Like dance?" "Not exactly." They talked for 10 minutes, casual. The weather, Los Angeles traffic. The man had a subtle accent, Hong Kong beneath American syllables, and spoke in short, precise sentences. Nothing wasted, no filler. Everything he said landed exactly where he aimed it. Ricky had met enough people in enough rooms to recognize when someone was sharp. This man was sharp in an unusual way, not intellectual, not clever, but aware. The kind of awareness that made you feel like he had already calculated every exit in the cabin without once breaking eye contact. "What branch?" the man asked. "Navy." "SEAL?" Another pause. "What gave it away this time?" "Your hands," the man said, glancing briefly downward, "and the way you reacted when that door shut in the back of the plane. Most people don't even notice it. You clocked it before the sound finished." Ricky studied the man for a moment. In his world, men who noticed things like that were either threats or allies. Usually you found out which fast. "You fight?" Ricky asked. "Occasionally," the man said. "What style?" "My own." Ricky leaned back. He'd heard that line before, usually from men who couldn't fight at all. "Right," he said, and turned back toward the window. The man beside him said nothing, didn't push it, didn't flinch, just went back to his book. And that stillness is what got to Ricky. Most people, when a seal looked away from them like that, got uncomfortable, shrunk, changed the subject. The small man did nothing. He simply existed with a completeness and a quiet confidence that filled the space around him without demanding attention. Ricky looked back. "What do you teach exactly?" The man looked up from his book. "Honestly, I teach people to stop fighting the way they think they should fight and start fighting the way they actually can." Ricky studied him. "You look like you weigh $135, 138 on a good day." Somewhere around the second hour, the conversation changed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't aggressive. It happened the way most important shifts happen, slowly, then suddenly. Ricky had opened up in the way combat veterans sometimes do with strangers, because strangers are safe, and 30,000 feet removes the stakes. He talked about training, about the gap between what they taught you in hand-to-hand school and what actually worked when someone was trying to kill you. He talked about speed, about how the strongest man in the room wasn't always the hardest to put down. The man listened, really listened, not the polite nodding of someone waiting for their turn to talk, but the focused, still listening of someone absorbing everything. Then he said, "What's the fastest punch you've ever seen?" Ricky thought about it. "One of our instructors, former boxer, I've seen him put men down before they saw it coming." "How far was his setup?" "What?" "Before the punch landed, how far back did he pull his arm?" Ricky frowned. "Maybe 6 inches? Could be less." The man nodded slowly. "From rest, with no setup at all, I can land a full force strike from 3 inches. Ricky looked at him flatly. "That's not possible." "I know. That's what makes it useful." Silence. The engine hum filled the cabin. Somewhere 3 rows back, a child was asking their mother about clouds. Ricky turned fully in his seat to face the man. He wasn't angry. He wasn't mocking. He was genuinely, clinically skeptical, the way a man trained to deal in facts deals with claims that contradict what he knows to be true. "Prove it," Ricky said. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he closed his book. He said, "Hold out your hand." Ricky held out his right hand, palm flat, parallel to his chest. It was a big hand, hardened, the hand of a man who would put people on the ground in real situations. The man raised his own right hand, placed his fist approximately 3 inches from Ricky's palm, close enough that the seal could feel the slight warmth of it. "Don't move your hand, and don't brace it, just hold it flat." Ricky had the thought, briefly, that this was going to be embarrassing for someone. He was right. He just had the wrong person in mind. The cabin was quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a smooth flight, the specific, pressurized quiet of a moment right before something changes. Ricky kept his hand flat, palm open, fingers relaxed, the way the man had asked. He wasn't bracing, he wasn't pulling back. He was giving the man exactly what he'd asked for, a fair target, undefended. His eyes were locked on the fist, 3 inches away. No wind-up, no chamber, no visible energy loading in the shoulder or the hip. Just a closed fist, hovering in the recycled air of a commercial aircraft cabin, close enough that Ricky could count the knuckles. He told himself, "I will see it." He had seen fast before. He had trained against the fastest hands in the United States military. He had been in rooms with men who made professional fighters look slow. His nervous system had been conditioned over years of high-stakes training to process movement faster than the average human brain. He told himself, "I will see it coming." He didn't. There was no warning, no shift in the shoulders, no flicker in the eyes, no intake of breath. One moment the fist was hovering, the next, Ricky's palm cracked backward. Not tapped, not pushed, cracked. The impact traveled through his hand, up his wrist, into his forearm like an electric current. His entire arm jolted, his shoulder rocked. The force moved through him the way a shock wave moves through water, not stopping at the surface, going through. 3 inches, full force, in the time it takes a human eye to complete a single blink. Ricky stared at his own hand. Then he looked at the man. The man hadn't moved. His posture was identical. His expression was unchanged. He was sitting in economy class on a commercial flight, and he had just, without raising his heart rate, sent a controlled explosion through the palm of a Navy SEAL. That, Ricky started. He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. Not because he didn't have words, because the words that existed for what had just happened were inadequate, and he knew it. He looked at his hand again, flexed his fingers. The impact had completely dissipated. No pain, no damage, but the memory of it was already burning itself into his nervous system like a brand. He had felt power before. Big men, trained men, men who could move serious weight. This was different. This wasn't size-generated force. This wasn't the accumulated momentum of a heavy arm swinging through space. This was something concentrated, compressed, distilled down to its absolute purest form, and delivered in a distance that shouldn't have been able to contain it. How? Ricky said. It wasn't even a full question. Structure, the man said quietly, not muscle. The entire body becomes the fist. In that fraction of a second, everything arrives at the same point. Ricky looked at him. Again, he said. The man obliged. 4 more times across the next 10 minutes, Ricky held out his hand. He tried different things. He tried watching the elbow. He tried watching the wrist. He tried watching the man's eyes, hunting for the micro-tell that his training said always preceded a strike. There was nothing. Every single time, the impact arrived before he perceived the movement. Every single time, the force was complete, precise, and unmistakable. By the 4th strike, the SEAL, a man who had been trained to maintain composure in situations most humans couldn't imagine, had gone completely, utterly silent. He sat back in his seat. He breathed slowly. He looked straight ahead at the seat back in front of him, like a man who had just had something fundamental restructured inside his understanding of the world. "I've never felt anything like that," he said finally. "Most people haven't," the man replied. He wasn't bragging. He said it the way a mathematician states a theorem, plainly, without decoration. "What do you train?" Ricky asked. "Wing Chun at the root, but I've spent years pulling it apart, keeping what works, discarding what doesn't. Most systems teach you to add. I've spent my career learning to remove." Ricky turned to him. "Remove what?" "Everything unnecessary. Ego, wasted motion, the performance of strength. Strip all of that away," he paused, "and what's left is very fast." They talked for another hour. Ricky learned that the man was an actor, that he had grown up in Hong Kong, that he had started a school in Seattle, then one in Los Angeles, and that he taught, quietly, selectively, some of the most famous people in the world. That he was working on a film, that Hollywood had already come to him twice and would come again. He learned the man's name 40 minutes before landing. It landed differently than he expected. He hadn't asked early because it hadn't mattered. The man didn't carry his name in front of him the way men with reputations usually do. He carried himself and let everything else follow. But when Ricky finally asked, the way you ask at the end of a long, genuine conversation, almost as an afterthought, the man told him. Ricky went still. He knew the name. Not from film, not from television, from a completely different world, from a conversation in a military training facility months earlier, where an instructor had mentioned, almost offhandedly, that the most efficient striker he had ever personally studied was a man out of Los Angeles, Chinese-American, who had developed a system of combat that had no wasted movement and could generate devastating force from distances that defied conventional understanding. He had dismissed it at the time. The way you dismiss things that don't fit inside the box of what you believe is possible. He wasn't dismissing anything now. "I know your name," Ricky said quietly. Bruce Lee nodded once, the way a man nods when the information is neither surprising nor particularly important to him. "The guy at Coronado," Ricky said almost to himself, referring to the naval base. "He mentioned you. I thought he was exaggerating." "People usually do," Bruce said. "He said you were the most dangerous man he'd ever seen move." A pause. "He was being generous," Bruce said. Then, with the corner of a smile, or accurate, depending on the day. The seatbelt sign flickered on. Los Angeles was 40 minutes out. Ricky looked at his hand one more time, the hand that had absorbed 4 strikes from a man who weighed less than most of the equipment he carried on operations. He flexed his fingers slowly, deliberately, like he was checking something real against something imagined. "Can you teach that?" Ricky asked. Bruce Lee looked at him without hesitation. "I can teach the mechanics, the how, the structure, the physics of it." He paused. "But the thing that actually makes it work, the thing that turns the mechanics into that," he gestured at Ricky's palm, "that takes years, and most people aren't willing to strip themselves down far enough to find it." "What do you mean, strip themselves down?" "Most people train to become more," Bruce said. "More muscle, more technique, more aggression, more strategy." He looked out the window at the approaching California coastline. "Real mastery goes the other direction. You train until you can be less, until there's no self-consciousness in the movement, no hesitation, no performance, just pure action, happening at the speed of instinct." He turned back. "That's where the speed lives. Not in the muscle, not in the arm." He touched his own chest once, lightly. "In here, when this is finally quiet." Ricky said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I've been fighting for 12 years. I know, I can tell. And I've never felt what I felt in this seat." Bruce Lee looked at him with that same quiet, level gaze. Not pride, not satisfaction, just honest acknowledgement. "Then today was a good day for both of us," he said simply. The plane landed at LAX at 6:47 in the evening. They stood in the aisle together waiting for the jetway. They didn't exchange cards, they didn't make plans. Men like these two don't perform connection. They recognize it briefly and let it stand on its own. At the gate, they shook hands. Bruce's grip was not crushing, it was exact. It made contact at the precise point it needed to and transmitted exactly the force required and nothing more. Even in a handshake, there was no waste. Ricky noticed that, too. "One last thing," Ricky said before they separated into the crowd. "That punch, the 3-inch punch, what's the fastest you've ever deployed it in a real situation?" Bruce Lee smiled, not the instructor's smile, not the measured smile he'd worn through the most of the flight, something different, something that had a small, genuine flash of satisfaction in it. By the time anyone would have needed to measure it, it was already over. And then he was gone. Into the crowd, into the terminal, into the city that would, 3 years later, watch him become a global legend. A man whose name would be spoken on every continent, in every martial arts school, in every conversation about what the human body is actually capable of when the mind finally gets out of the way. Ricky Davenport stood at the gate for a long moment after he disappeared. Then he picked up his bag and walked in the other direction. He never told the story publicly.
not for years. When he finally did, in a private conversation with a fellow SEAL who pushed him on it, he said this: "I have been in rooms with dangerous men my entire adult life. I know what danger feels like before it moves. And that man on that flight, in a gray jacket, reading a book, drinking water, was the most dangerous thing I have ever sat next to. Not because he was aggressive, not because he was large, not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because he had taken the thing that most men spend their whole lives building up and made it disappear. Left nothing but pure, invisible capability. No warning, no signal, nothing to read, just result." He paused. "You can't train against what you can't detect, and I couldn't detect a single thing about him until it was already done."
Bruce Lee never talked about that flight. He rarely talked about individual encounters at all. He talked about principles, about water, about the formless that takes every form, about the arrogance of systems that teach men to be more, when the real answer was always to become less and faster. He once wrote, "It's not the daily increase, but daily decrease. Hack away at the unessential." Most people read that as philosophy. The Navy SEAL in row 14 understood it as something else entirely. He understood it as an instruction manual for the 3-inch punch that arrived before he could see it, for the grip that was perfectly efficient and nothing beyond, for the man who sat in an economy seat for 3 hours and occupied the space around him so completely, so quietly, that you'd have looked right through him if you didn't know. Bruce Lee weighed 138 pounds. He stood 5 feet 7. He looked in plain clothes, like a man you wouldn't remember. That was the point. He had spent his entire life removing every single thing that didn't need to be there, until what remained was so concentrated, so distilled, so purely functional, that it operated at a speed the human eye simply wasn't built to track. Size didn't beat him. Weight didn't intimidate him. Rank didn't impress him, because none of those things had anything to do with what he had mastered. He mastered the removal of the unnecessary. He mastered the silence before the movement. He mastered the art of being, completely, in the single fraction of a second when everything counts, with zero hesitation, zero ego, zero wasted energy between intention and result. A Navy SEAL sat next to him on a flight and had no idea who he was. By the time the wheels touched down in Los Angeles, he understood something about combat and about the nature of real capability that 12 years of military training hadn't taught him. Bruce Lee didn't need you to know who he was. He just needed 1 moment, 3 inches of space, and less than the time it takes you to blink. That was always enough. The footage never existed. No camera was rolling in row 14. No report was filed. No documentation was made. Just 2 men, 30,000 feet over California, and a single strike that lasted less than a millisecond, and lasted, in the memory of the man who felt it, for the rest of his life. If this story hit different, if you felt something watching Bruce Lee move through this world with that kind of quiet, devastating purpose, then you already understand what he was trying to teach. Subscribe, because we're just getting started. The stories history almost forgot, we find them every single time.